Okay, so we're about to get started. We've got to go through a few things that are more technical, administrative things. First off, today you're going to get back your first grade sheet from the class. And so for those of you that have been in one of my classes before, this is the standard grade sheet you'll get. But if you haven't been in there, there's a lot of information, and I'd like to go through it so that you have an understanding of what's actually happening on a particular grade sheet. So this is one from a previous semester with the names blacked out, so you don't know who it is or anything. A couple things. One, first off, the thing that everybody cares most about is right here in the little dashed box. That's your overall grade. If you're passing the class, it's going to be green in color. If something's wrong, it's going to be yellow or red. So I try to color code it so it's really obvious if things are going bad. So look there in that little box. You should see a grade percentage, and you should also see what the equivalent letter grade is. Okay, that's your overall grade for the class. Above that, in the row above here, is the class average grade. So you can always see how you compare to the class average. So in this case, for this semester, the class average was 88%, which is also a B, but this particular student was getting an 80%, which was still a B. At DVC, there are no pluses and minuses, so if you haven't taken a class here before, it's kind of a win-lose scenario. It's great if you work really, really hard and just barely crest into that grade category. So if you got a 79.8 and roll into the B category, that's awesome. You got a full B like everybody else. If you worked really, really hard and got an 89.4, not quite an A, you get the same B that somebody else got that was very low. So they're round grades, if that makes sense. Just something to be aware of. I think it helps your grade point average on the whole. So to get an A, you have to crest that 89.5%, and then you'll get an A. And it doesn't matter whether you get 89.6 or you get 98. You're still going to get the same A. So just be aware of that as you go forward. So moving on, as we go into this next block here, this is where your assignments all show up. So at this point, there's only been assignment 101, so you're only going to see grades in that first little box. The average for assignment 101 was 91%. This particular student got a 94 on assignment 101. So it gives you reference points. The little triangles and the yellows just mean that those assignments haven't happened yet. So we've got 102, 103, 104. You get the idea. Nothing's happening there. Comments right over here. Typically, if your grade is bad when you get the grade sheet back right now, it's because you haven't been doing your comments. So in this case, the total comments that this student wrote were 3, which is only 14% of the required 22 comments. So time to make some more comments. The good news is they're cumulative. It's just a number at the end of the semester. So you can catch up. Not a problem. Then we move into the exercises bar, which is this big bar right here that goes all the way across. This tells you how you're doing on various exercises. You can safely ignore anything with a triangle going forward. So all of this doesn't matter at this stage of the game. These ones do matter. If you did it, you get 100%. Remember, it's a pass, not pass. If you didn't do it or didn't post it, you get a 0. So in this case, as we're going through, there's lots of hundreds, and then there's a hole. I color code these in yellow so that you can really easily look at your bar. You want the bar at the end of the semester to be all green. That means you did them all, and you get all that. So as we come down here a little bit further, this is kind of where all the breakdown happens. So there's your assignment 101. There's your 94%. And here's some verbiage about where your grade falls in those various spectrums. As we come down the list, obviously there's nothing written for any of the next assignments because we haven't done them yet. I know you guys turned in 102, but obviously I haven't graded it because you just turned it in. Your exercises, it says see exercise bar above. That just means go up and look and see what you're missing. Comments are only officially applied at the end of the semester, so you can still make up for missing comments. If you're missing them, you can make up for them. Your participation grade, remember that's the part that includes your whether you're here in class or not, whether you're telling me if you're going to be gone. That, you can look at my little notes up here. You've missed 1 day of class. You've notified me of 0 absences. You've been late 0 times. So that's going to vary for everybody. If you notify me, you get a little bit back. It's not quite as bad as just blowing me off, for lack of a better term. If you don't show up for class, you miss more points than if you tell me you're not going to be in class. If you're late, you lose a little bit too. So in this case, that affects your participation grade for the class. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully, it's by talking through it, it makes a little bit more sense. So you guys will get this today. I haven't actually printed them yet, so I have to go. Once you guys get started on your lab, I'll go print them and get them and bring them back. So I apologize. I was trying this morning, but I ran out of time. So I like to go through all that so that you guys can see how that works. We're going to start on typography in just a second. But I did also give you today was a big, heavy paperwork day. You got your assignment 103, which is the lecture series poster. If you're an industrial design student, you don't have to do an architecture lecture series. You can do a industrial design lecture series. That's totally OK with me. If you're an architecture student, do an architecture lecture series. It needs to be 11 by 17 in size, so it's 2, like that. It's like the poster on the door, the Ace Club poster. It's that size. You're going to be doing it in that size. It needs to contain the names of all the lecturers and the dates they're going to lecture. If you don't feel creative, you can use last spring's lecture series. You can use all those lecturers. That's fine. If you feel creative, you can invent whoever's going to come and speak. I've had ones in the past that have invited a bunch of dead people to come back and speak, which was kind of entertaining. But if that's something you want to do, by all means, it's OK. So this is about the graphic design of it, not the fact that they're dead and can't come lecture. So you feel free to make up whoever you want your lecture series to be, or you can use the lecture series from last semester. It's due next Wednesday, so not this coming Wednesday, but the Wednesday after, the 10th, at the start of class. So you guys kind of see that these assignments follow about the same pattern. We've got a couple, week and a half to do them, etc. 3 comments, etc. If you have questions, let me know, but that's there. Keep that in the back of your mind. Today we're going to talk about typography, or text and fonts, and how they play into the world of graphic design. So let's begin with typography, and then ultimately we'll get into InDesign, and I'll show you a bunch of stuff about typography, and then you'll do your exercise for today. So we need to start with a definition of terms for typefaces so that when I throw out things like, what's your X height, or whatever, you understand what I'm talking about in that particular context. So we'll start with some of the easy ones. Style, we've got a regular style, we've got an italic style, and we've got a bold style. These are pretty common. Control B, make it bold. You guys have done this in Word, not too much to it. They're often used to provide contrast and emphasis. You want to show something, you want to say that something's a quote, you might italicize it. Generally speaking, if you can choose the style from within the font family, that's better than having the operating system do it for you. Let me show you an example. So we've got two different text examples here. The ones that you're seeing right now are the operating system version. So in this case, we've got a regular, let me draw on it really quick. This is the regular font. This is the operating system italicized font. This is a bold, and this is a bold italic. And this is just a long string of italics. If I go forward, we can see the font family versus the operating system. And this is something that unless you see it, you don't necessarily realize it, but it does make a difference. So when I talk about the font family version of a bold or an italic, essentially the person who designed or created the font in the first place took the time to create an italicized version of the font and a bold version of the font. And by doing that, they spent a lot more care with how the letters and the letter forms look, and it's going to make your italicized version better. The operating system just says, take the base font, slant it over. Now it's italicized. They don't spend any more time on it than that. So if we look at this first example that I'm showing you up top here, I think it's particularly noticeable in the italicized version. So you can see that this essentially all it did was tip the letters over. The operating system said, take the base font, tip the letters over, nothing more. Up here in the font designed italicized version, see how the Z has a little bit more flair to it? It's little details like that that make that font look just a little bit better. Same thing with the bold italic, same thing with the bold. In the bold, we're getting thicker stroke in the center, less in the Y. So you can see right there, look at the Y, for example. Let me clear. Look at the Y and look at the Y. They're very different in terms of thinking about where the stroke thickness is, what makes that bold, what makes it not bold. If we look down here at the bottom example, there's the tip the letters over version versus an italicized designed font. You can tell that that looks a lot better than just the tipped over version. So if you can, choose from within the font family rather than just pressing Control-I or Control-B. And the way that you'll do that is you'll see in the font family when you go to pick the font, it'll say, Arial italics, Arial bold italic, as opposed to just picking Arial and then saying make it italic. Weight refers to the relative lightness or darkness of the letter forms marked by changes in the stroke or line width. So we have a light font, we have a medium font, we have a bold font. Sometimes some fonts that are very well established have all of these designed within them. So we've got a really comprehensive list. So here's an example here. Helvetica Neue, if you work on a Mac, Helvetica Neue has this where we have all of these different weights to the fonts. We start at thin, very, very thin light letter forms, and we go all the way down to super. And you can see how much different those change over that course of the font. Width refers to the different variations within the typeface family. So we might have a condensed or a compressed version of a font. We also have an extended version of a font sometimes. Chances are you were in high school English and you needed your paper to be a little bit longer because your English teacher said make it 2 pages and you only had 1.5 pages. And so you went and looked through your fonts and you said, there's an extended font. It'll make my paper look longer. And you picked it. Right? It's kind of like when you said, I'm not going to do 12 point, I'm going to do 12.2 point font. And you make that just a little bit longer. See, we all know these tricks. These are known things. The truth is I'm going to tell you today how to actually do this without being obvious. So see, there's value to this class, I promise, right? So I will tell you how to do it later. X height refers, no surprise, to the height of a lowercase x. And this is a way of distinguishing different fonts and comparing fonts to one another, because a lowercase letter height is going to vary depending on the font that you pick. And that's normal. So x height refers to this height of a lowercase letter, or the height of an x. And it's easily determined by looking at an x. Cap height refers to the height of a capital letter. The cap height is measured, and I have a graphic that'll show all of these together in just a second. The cap height is measured from the baseline, or the bottom of the most of the letters, to the top of a capital letter. The x height and the cap height vary by typeface and are useful comparisons. If you want to combine 2 different typefaces, 2 different fonts, you need to make sure that their x height and cap heights match for them to go together. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So let's look here at the example. This helps a lot to kind of see it. We've got our cap height line going right across here. No surprise. There's my capital letter. There's the height of the cap height. My x height right here going up to the height of an x. We do have a descender and we have an ascender. The ascenders stick up. It's the top of an H, for example. A descender would be the bottom of a P, the bottom of a G, things that stick down below the line, below the baseline. And so there is a descender height and an ascender height as part of this as well. They're not quite as important to keep track of, but at least I'll tell you about them. Counters are the white spaces in and around the letter forms. They affect legibility, readability, and the general density of the font that you're looking at. Thin fonts at large scales have open counters that can overpower the light strokes. So it's harder to read them because they're so thin and they have a lot of space around them. The opposite is true for bold fonts. So let's look at an example. So errors twice. The big one is a little bit hard to read because there's so much space in and around the letters, and the font itself is rather thin. The opposite is true for the really bold font. That's small. There's not space around it, so it makes it's a little bit harder for us to see it. So as you think about choosing a font, think about the size that it's going to be, and think about whether it's appropriate in that size and whether you can really read it or not. Small capitals are complete sets of uppercase letters that are the same height as a lowercase letter, an x height. So essentially, they're a capital letter that's an x height. They're often used when large capitals would result in unwanted emphasis. So let's say you're writing a paper, and that paper uses some acronyms, where you're replacing letters. When you start to use those, if you were writing a long, wordy paper, if you use full height capital letters, they would stand out in your paragraph. You'd see all these big capital letters showing up. Versus a small cap They're the same height as an X height, and they're not going to be emphasized as much. So it can be a good strategy for that. Sometimes in a title, you might do a regular capital letter and then do small caps for the remainder of the title, providing some emphasis. Lining and non-lining figures. Figures here means numbers. In font terms, they're called figures, but we can translate that into numbers. Lining figures are a set of numerals with the same width and height as full capital letters. Non-lining figures share the same X height as lowercase letters, and they include ascenders and descenders. So let's look at them. It's always easier to see the example, but I have to get through the definition first. So in the first example over here, these are our lining numerals. They're the same height as a capital letter. And if you look at the paragraph, this is always a little bit easier to see. We can see that there's a few points where these numbers are used. $15 discounted by 32 cents, sold at Amazon, $10.50. They tend to stand out. If you kind of squint at the paper, you can see that those numbers stand out because they're big. They're the height of a capital letter. A non-lining over here, essentially, this is the X height. There's your X. That's the X height, and we have a descender at the bottom of the 3. We have an ascender at the top of the 6. And so if we look at that same paragraph, there's those same 3 pieces. They flow within the context of the text. So they don't stand out anymore. They're just part of the paragraph. So they can have a good effect, depending on your purpose. So if you're writing long paragraphs with numbers in them, using a non-lining figure would be a good idea, versus something where you're having them stand out. Ligatures are specially designed characters that are produced by combining letters together. So the best example here is things that you would naturally write by hand. And you can see this happen. So my son's name is Bennett, okay, and it ends in 2 T's. So if I were writing his name, I'm just going to write up here. What would I do? I would do the T's like that. All of you would do the T's like that too. You wouldn't write Bennett like that. Doesn't feel right, right? This is natural. You would do it. So this is what I'm talking about. Instead of using a font and having it put a T and then a separate T like that, it changes this set of characters into that, because that's how we would write it. So let's look at some other examples on the next page. So here we go. F and I. The dot, the top of the F is close and collides with the I. We can make that F be the top of the I. And again, these are natural things that you would do as you start to draw. The 2 F's together, notice one of the F's is a little bit shorter than the second F. Likewise, the cross between the 2 F's ends up in the top of the I. So you can see how these things start to come together. These top set, this set, are kind of the standard ones. When we get down into the discretionary ligatures, this is the font designer's choice as to whether they're doing it. Some of these get a little funky. I wouldn't write an S and then somehow have the T come, and somehow have the T come around, and I don't know. I wouldn't write that. But some font designers think that looks good, so they do it. The top of the G becomes the I. The Q underneath, okay, I could kind of see that. So it just depends a little bit on the font designer as to what they're doing. The contextual ligatures, you almost don't discern. They're little spacing issues. They're highlighted in red if you look really carefully, like between the R and the V. There's little subtle changes. They almost look like shadows that have happened. So the good news about ligatures is they automatically happen. Assuming the font designer did a good job and actually created the characters, when you type the characters, it will automatically substitute in the correct ligatures for you. Choosing the right font. Anybody taken 121 this semester? Few of you. Did you turn your first poster in and have Daniel say, nope, do it again because your font was wrong? Nobody? Good job. It's almost always the case. At least nobody's willing to admit it. It's almost always the case that that's the first thing that happens when you do your first poster is you put the wrong font in and he throws them all out. It's just normal. So we have to think about how are we choosing a particular font. And it could be about the context. What are we writing about? It could be how long is this piece going to be around? Are we trying to be trendy? Are we trying to be classic? What's the difference? What's the purpose of the piece? Is it a financial paper? Or is it something that my daughter in second grade would be reading? They're different. Different fonts would be a good choice. Is it innovative? Does that make it outdated later on? That has to do with the longevity of the piece. Is it traditional? Is it too conservative? All of those things start to matter. So, for example, 2009, Avatar came out. They used a font called Papyrus. It became really, really, really popular. And so we had it on like Windows, and we had it on takeout places. It didn't age well, right? It's the same Papyrus font. We don't want to see it anymore. You have to be aware of what's trendy and that maybe you don't want to use it. So be aware of those kinds of things. Typeface selection. Sometimes the best thing to do is to just compare one font against another font. Try it in one, see how it looks. Switch over to another, try it in that font. And of course, we all develop our favorites. There's no surprise that you develop your favorites, you get obsessive about one, and you turn in every paper in one particular font. Some of you don't pay any attention, and you turn every paper in whatever the default font is on your computer, which is probably Times New Roman, and you just turn it in that way. But you as a graphic designer, you as a designer in general, this is your realm. You should care what it looks like. You should care what the font looks like. Pay attention to readability. Is it evoking the correct emotion? Is this particular thing about modernism, in which case it should be a sans serif, nice modernist font? Is it appropriate? Does it reflect the needs of the client and of the viewer? This is the other thing we talked about last class. Who's the client? Who's the viewer? Does your choice in font reflect that need? So here's an example. It's a Charles Dickens. And if we were looking at these two fonts, they're essentially the same, right? They look the same. They're both serif fonts. One of the fonts, the one on the right, Baskerville, was designed in the same country at about the same time as this passage was written. It's subtle, but using that font is a little bit more appropriate. The one on the right is just Times New Roman. It's the default font in most operating systems. It's OK. But it's that little extra care that you as a designer can put into your pieces that makes a difference. Another example side by side. Same passage of text, written a little bit differently, different fonts. They look different. So you need to look at these and you need to evaluate them and decide which one is working, which one feels better. And if I had these up and I took a show of hands as to who liked the left one and who liked the right one, it would vary in the room. So it's not necessarily a right or a wrong choice in this case. It's a choice based on you, the designer, of what you think looks best. I just think this graphic is pretty funny. The periodic table of typefaces working their way all the way down into the Old English category. So you might want to spend some time looking at it because it's humorous. It's more a slide just for the fun of it than anything else. This is another infographic that I thought was pretty fun. So you need to choose a typeface. And essentially, you can start out tracing any one of these lines. You want to create a newspaper. You want to create a logo. It'll ask you questions, and you'll end up at a particular font. The entertaining thing is if I followed the book line through and answered the questions honestly, I would end up at the font that I happened to choose for the book that I wrote, which is kind of bizarre. I didn't read this first. It happened afterward. Optima became my favorite font. I wrote my whole thesis in that font, so I was kind of obsessed about it for a while. Sans serif and serif fonts. What's the difference? So you've heard me refer to this a couple times already today. This is something that you do really need to know because it's going to vary and you need to know why these matter. So first off, a serif font has little tails on it. And you can see it's isolated up here at the top with the red circle. It has little tails. Those little curvy flicks at the ends of the lines make it much easier for our eyes to read. And if you pick up any paperback book, any magazine, anything where you're going to be doing a lot of reading, it's almost always going to be a serif font because it's just easier to read. It can be smaller and you can read it faster. A sans serif font, on the other hand, is very clean. It doesn't have those tails, and it works really nice in a presentation where it can be a little bit larger. So you'll see in current web trends and web design, a lot of the fonts that you see online are sans serif fonts because they're displayed a little bit bigger than they would be in a magazine. Remember, if you were doing a magazine or a book, the number of pages you're printing costs more money. So if you were paying $2 for a magazine and you could cut a couple pages out of the magazine, a couple cents out of the magazine, you'd make more money. So making the font size smaller is a good thing in that context. On the web, it doesn't cost any more to have the font a little bit bigger. No harm in changing your font size, making it a little bit bigger, because you have to do that to make it a little bit easier to read. So here's two examples, side by side. One is a sans serif. The one on the left is a sans serif. It's a little bit harder to read. The one on the right is a serif font. It's a little bit easier to read if you squint at it. So it doesn't matter what it says. It's just the idea that one font is a little bit easier and a little bit harder to read. So you say, well, wait a minute. What if I want to use both? Well, that's not a bad strategy. And that's where we get into combining typefaces. So first off, before we combine any typefaces, if you want to provide emphasis, you want to create a hierarchy, you don't technically need to use multiple fonts. You can use the same font, just different subsets of that font. You could use a bold, an italic, and a regular version of your font and get this hierarchy very easily. So it could be within a single family, just using different styles of the font. That's certainly a good strategy. You could also use different sizes of the font. That can work too. Adding multiple families together can provide almost endless combinations within the design. So here we go. This is an example all in the family. We have the heading, that is the bold version of the font, and then we have the rest of this, that's the standard version of the font. Looks nice. They go together. Looks like a good pairing. No surprise, they're the same font. Combining typefaces, if we wanted to use more than one, the trick here is you don't combine two serif typefaces or two sans serif typefaces. You combine a serif with a sans serif. They go together much better. You want to make sure that they have similar x heights and widths, because they're not going to look right if they don't have similar x heights and widths. So an example here, Big Castellan and Myriad Pro. If we look at them, I should have made these a little bit bigger, right? Our baselines are the same as they go across, and our x heights are the same as they go across there. That makes them go together nicely. There's a serif and a sans serif, and those two can be combined nicely together. If you're ever in doubt and you're trying to find a pairing of fonts and you really don't know and you can't figure out how to check the x height or whatever, do a Google search. What font pairs with X? Whatever it is, whatever the font name is. And at least then you'll get somebody's opinion about what pairs nicely together. So here's another example here where we're combining a sans serif and a serif font. And you can see them go together. They're different pairs. They have different x heights. But if we're comparing the third one down, for example, to the top, the x height is much taller on the third one down. But the x height of the serif and the sans serif match. And that's important to keep track of. You can also do display or script typefaces for your titles. Okay, you guys have all done the script typeface before. It's one of the fun things to play around with on a computer. It looks like fancy cursive or whatever. If you did your entire English paper or your history paper in that font that was all scripty and cursive and handed it into your history teacher, do you think they'd like you very much? Nope. So it's good for a title, good for a heading, but don't do the whole body in that. So some examples. Designing with type. Legibility and readability. So fundamentally, we're trying to communicate messages to somebody. We're putting pictures and we're putting words together to tell somebody something. You want to make sure that your particular piece is both legible and readable, and they're different. So legibility means, can you recognize the individual letters and their relative position to other letters? Is it clear? Are the letters themselves clear? And readability is, how is the typography presented to the viewer as words, lines, and paragraphs? So we both want my piece to be legible. Can I distinguish the individual letters? And how's the words, the lines, and the paragraphs? How easily readable is that? So here's another chart. I apologize, this one's a little bit blurry, but I think it helps. So legibility, remember, legibility is individual letters. And if we look at the first font here, Arial, pretty easy to read. I know it's a little blurry. Then we move over into the Mesquite font. It's like the barbecue font. If we look at the individual letters, they're much harder to distinguish, right? It takes more concentration to read those. So that's legibility. Readability is, if I was going to read a paragraph of this, how easy is it to read that paragraph? Generally here, a serif font works nice versus a sans serif. Makes it a little bit easier to read. Impact, or a big bold font, works for the headline. Big subheading, not so much for the whole paragraph. It's too much, too dense, too bold. And then context. Times New Roman, this is financial. I want it to be a serif font like that. Comic Sans. So imagine you were Elon Musk, and you were writing an email, or I guess it would be a tweet in his case. But let's say he was writing an email to the board, or he was writing a letter to the board, and he chose to write his letter in Comic Sans. Do you think they'd take him seriously? Nope. Even though he's really smart and friggin' has Teslas coming out wherever, something so simple like that can screw everything up. I'm not saying that was why he was forced out, but you get the idea. Something like that could matter. So make sure you're choosing what's appropriate. Objective representation. This is practical and straightforward. It's clear, ordered presentation of information. Easy to do, easy to set up. Subjective representation, this is a little bit more loose. This is where there isn't as clear of a setup, but it's heavily focused on a theme or an idea that creates a big experience. And so this can be done. It's a lot harder. I'm going to suggest for your posters that you work in the objective level rather than the subjective level. Macro perspectives. This is looking at the overall design and layout, the format, the composition. We're going to talk all about this next class. And that contains the typographic hierarchy and the placement of elements. So establishing this hierarchy. What's the heading? What's the subheading? What's the body context? And being consistent with those pieces. Then we look at micro perspectives, which is essential to small details. These are the little things that matter. When you look closely at something, are the details right? Kerning, spacing, ragging, clean presentation, consistent application of that particular font. So something like this, I can't read it, but if we look at the fonts, it's really nicely done. They work well together. They combine well together. Symmetry and asymmetry, and again, we'll go through all this layout stuff. There's a little bit of a preview of what's coming. Symmetrical, balance and harmony. Asymmetry, activity. You draw your attention to something specific. Alignment is the horizontal and vertical position of the text within the margins of your page. The alignment creates the visual relationships between the elements of design. So how you choose to align your text where it is in the overall context matters. Typographic color. This refers to the relative density or the gray value of a block of text. So if you squint at the blocks of text over here on the right and you look at it, is there one that looks darker than all the others? Yeah? Is there a few that look a little bit lighter than all the others? That's the typographic color. So these elements, these blocks of text, work just like an image or just like some other graphic design element that's on the page. How dense and dark they are matters. It shows how they stand out against other elements. So you have to look at a paragraph not just as a bunch of words with some content in them, but what they look like from an overall graphic design. How do they fit within the context of what you're doing? Type size. You guys have all done this one before. Measured in points. Changes in type size often result in a nice hierarchy of elements. If you establish hierarchy, 14 point, 12 point, 10 point, 14 point, 10 point, 8 point. If there's some hierarchy there, that can help. Develop a proportionate scale of sizes that you use over and over again. Don't just arbitrarily pick a specific size. Think about what that size should be, how readable, how legible that size is, and then go from there. Case. Lowercase letters are far more readable than uppercase letters. There's a reason that architects draw in all capital letters. We want to emphasize letter to letter. We want you to read everything that we have to say and not just skim over it. So you have to concentrate. And if you look at this, it's a little bit harder to read the capital set. So let me show you another example here. For example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word appear. Okay, that's hard to read, right? Try to read it in lowercase. For example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word appear. The only important thing is that the first and last letter are in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. Pretty funny, huh? So our brains are really good at this. We can adapt, we can read. But if we're in this letter form, even I have to concentrate to try to read this, because it's letter-to-letter recognition versus overall words. Kerning adjusts the space between individual letters. So we're going to talk about two things, kerning and tracking, and they're different. Kerning is the space between individual letters. And this is kind of like those ligatures where we combine the two T's. In here, if you were writing type, for example, TY, you would naturally put the T and then tuck the Y underneath part of the T. It would be natural, right? Same thing here. We adjust it so that from the default spacing, we pull that Y over a little bit so that it tucks underneath the T. This is kerning, individual letters. Are you going to go through your entire 10-page, 80-page history paper and do kerning between every letter? Absolutely not. Would you do it for the title page? Yeah, probably a good idea. So this is for headings, for titles. That's where it's going to matter. It allows the text to flow and read smoothly. It's TYVAYI, 11, 19. Those are the combinations that you need to pay a little bit of attention to. Again, only in a heading scenario where it's a big block of text or big text. Tracking, on the other hand, adjusts the spacing between words, lines, and paragraphs. And this can greatly improve readability. Depending on what size your font is and what font you've chosen, this can greatly improve readability. It also influences the typographic color. You increase the tracking, the paragraph gets a little bit lighter as a block. So remember I told you that if you took nothing away, I was going to tell you how to make your English paper longer without them knowing? Right here. Right? You need a little bit extra space in your particular paper. This is where you can add it without being obvious. So you keep the same size font, you increase that tracking just a little bit. The reason that it works is because it's not adjusting space just between words or font size being bigger. It's adjusting a little bit of space in between every letter in your entire document. It's adjusting a little bit more space in between every word in your document. It's adjusting a little bit more space in between every sentence in your document. It's adjusting a little bit more space in between every paragraph. And it's all proportional. So it just feels a little bit easier to read. And so if your English teacher comes back and say, wait a minute, this didn't seem long enough, you say, well, I was just trying to make it easier to read. For you. I was thinking of you. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't want to say that, but. Leading, the space between lines of text. So in Word, this is like double space, single space, 1.5 space. In the world of InDesign, we call it leading. And it's basically from one baseline to the next. And so single space, in Word terms, is essentially converted over into InDesign in leading. And that would be, you take your font. So let's say I was working in 12-point font. Your leading would be like 14.2. And there's a default value for single space. If you wanted it to be double space, you take your font size, 14 point, and you double the font size, and that would be your leading. So if it was 14, it would be 28, would be your leading. So it's a little bit different, but it gives you much finer control, if that makes sense, over how much space is in between. Tall X heights, heavy typefaces, sans serifs need more leading than shorter, lighter, wider serif typefaces. So again, if it's a serif, it can be compressed and is still very readable. If it's a sans serif, you need more space around the letters. I'm going to flip through a few examples. We're going to be creating a portfolio. We'll do a whole lecture. Actually, we'll do several lectures on portfolio. But I like to throw some examples. I'm focusing here on the typography. So this is all within a typeface. They didn't combine different typefaces. But you can see how nicely the headings work in conjunction with other pieces. Subheadings. There's a really nice hierarchy here. And it's carefully thought out. That doesn't have any type, but it looks nice. Right, another example here of the ultra bold and how that fits together. Very, very nicely done. Another example, this one ended up a little blurry, and I apologize. I did this because it has the all capital letters for the quote. Letter-to-letter recognition, you have to slow down and you have to read that quote very carefully. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. Let's come back at 9, and we'll do the InDesign portion. I'll tell you how to do all of this stuff that I've been talking about in the world of InDesign, and we'll talk about text in InDesign as well. Okay, so we're going to continue on with exercise 110, and I'm going to talk through type in InDesign. It's a little bit different than something like Word because there's a lot more options in terms of what you can do and how you can create your text. So I went ahead and I opened up InDesign, and I stopped here because I wanted to remind you guys on creating the new document. We'll start on this splash screen by clicking on Create New. And we don't really care too much about the sizes because our default size is a letter size. But if I went to print, this is where you can see all the default sizes. When you guys are doing the 11 by 17 for your poster series, it's going to be tabloid. But for our purposes today, we'll do a letter size piece. Remember, I can change my units if I want here. I can switch over into inches. I can also change my orientation if I wanted it to be landscape or portrait. For our purposes, we can uncheck facing pages because we're not worried about creating a book just yet. And the rest of this is all fine. I'll go ahead and click on Create. I could set my margins to 0, or I could set my margins to any value that I wanted them to be. I'll leave them at 0.5. Doesn't really matter for what we're creating today. And I'll go ahead and click on Create. And that gives me my 8.5 by 11 white document. This looks similar to the last time we were in InDesign, where what I see is my piece of paper, and how I place my objects is going to be on that particular piece of paper. So first off, when we start thinking about text in the world of InDesign, we're going to be creating frames that contain text. And we can do that in 2 ways. One, we could create a box using the Type tool. So if I were to click on the T here for Type, I could create a box. I could say, I'll create a box that is, we'll go about there, like that. I could also, alternatively, create a frame or any other shape. So if I went over here into the ellipse tool, for example, that is an ellipse. But if after I created the ellipse, if I went to the T tool and then clicked inside of it, I can use it as a text frame and start typing my text. So any shape that you can create, you can end up using as a frame that holds text. I'm going to delete that for right now. So let me create a couple text blocks here. There's my first one. I'll come over here to my second one, and we'll create that one. I'm creating 2 columns for right now just so you can see how this works. You can create this layout however you want in terms of how you play around with it. Actually, let me go ahead and create a 3rd column. That was just a copy and a paste because I want to use this as an illustration. So first thing I need to do is I need to actually get some text to put in here. Now, of course, I could use the text tool. I could click inside, and I could start typing, blah, blah, blah. Instead, for our purposes today, I'm going to give you text that you can fill in these boxes so that you can learn the process. So on the course website, under today's exercise, is a Word document that you can download. And of course, I didn't log into the Digital Tools site this morning, so I don't have it up for you. But it's the first option. Come on, Internet. So if you go to our exercise today is 110. And this first item here in the download section, that's the Word file that you can download. I already have it downloaded. It is the first chapter of Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture. It doesn't really matter. It's just some filler text that we can work with. So just like I did with an image frame, I can do the same thing with the text frame, where I can actually place in a Word document. So I'll select the first frame here. I'll go to File and then Place. And I'm going to choose that Vitruvius text that I just downloaded. Now remember, this has to be saved on your flash drive so that it can load when it needs to. So when you first open it, you need to know where it is. I'm going to go ahead and select it as my Word document, and then I'll go ahead and click on Open. And this is going to pop up. The original document was done in a different font than the font that we currently have installed on the system. It doesn't matter. We're going to substitute the fonts in just a second. So go ahead and just click on Close. And we can let the text drop itself in. Now when the text first drops in here, it's highlighted in pink. And that's because it doesn't have a font assigned to it just yet. So I could take all of the font. I could double click to get inside, and then press Control A to select all. I could also go up to Edit and then select all. And I could assign a font. So this one was in Times-Roman. Our computer doesn't have Times-Roman on the... it has Times New Roman. So I'd have to come down and find Times New Roman, and then it will switch, and the little pink highlight will go away. That's just InDesign's way of saying, wait a minute, the font hasn't been applied correctly. OK, so I have this bit of font, or this bit of text that's inside of that text box so far. Down at the bottom right corner, you see how there's that little red box with a plus icon in it? That means that there is more text than fits in this one column of text. So if I wanted my text to continue in this text box, all I have to do is come down and click on that little plus sign right there. And when I click on it, well, it's not going to let me. Let me go to my direct select, my black arrow, my regular selection tool. Now I can click on it. Sorry, I wasn't in the selection tool. And you see that it kind of loads up a little bit of text on my cursor. And I could then move up to this text box and click. And when I move into that text box, the cursor changes to a little set of chain links. And I could say, OK, continue this text into that text box. I still have the plus sign, so I could click on it again, and I could say, you know what, continue it into this text box. Now, I know there's still a plus sign, and you guys are only working with one page today, so no matter how you do it, you're not going to fit all the document on one page. That's fine. You can end up chaining it into another page if you wanted to. The awesome thing about this is, unlike other software packages, this works and changes based on how I change these text boxes. So if, for example, we could see that skillful with the pencil, instructed in geometry, etc., if I were to make this text box a little bit bigger, the text changes as I move that text box. So I could make those closer like that. I could also come down here and make this one longer and have more text showing up. If I decided, you know what, I really would rather have this a little bit shorter, it's going to continue and flow into this text box. So the text is always going to flow through the chain, no matter how you adjust it, which is great for any kind of a document that contains columns or pictures. So if I suddenly decided that I wanted a picture in here, I could then add the picture, and the text would flow around the picture and keep going in the rest of my document. I don't have to carefully control that. We'll let InDesign do the work. I'm going to go ahead and delete this text box here, and I'll make this second text box go all the way to the bottom, and there it is. So I have the text here established. Now I want to start to think about what's happening in the text and how do I adjust the text itself. So first off, I'm going to zoom in. I'll press Control+, and we'll go in one more time. There we go. And so we'll look at this first chapter, chapter 1. We've got a heading here, then we've got a subheading, and then we have the actual text. So if I was establishing a hierarchy, first thing I would do is I would need chapter 1 to be a little bit bigger. So I could select chapter 1. I could come up here and I could say I'm going to change the size. So right now it's at 16 point. Maybe I'll go to 18 point. So that means a little bit bigger. Maybe 24, chapter 1. I'm going to delete the link here. I don't need the link, so we'll make that go away. And here, this subheading, okay, this one yeah, it feels about right in terms of chapter heading, subheading, and then text itself. Maybe the text itself needs to be a little bit smaller. We'll get to that in just a second. So I have this chapter 1 set. I could go in and look at this carefully and adjust the kerning, the spacing between the letters, to make it feel right. So it's all in capital letters. The places that there's some issues, the H to the A has a little bit of an issue. The A to the P has a little bit of an issue. So I'd want to go through and adjust that. I can do that by putting my cursor in between the two letters that need adjustment. And then coming up here, there's a V/A. This is the kerning. And I can adjust that. There are presets to make it closer or to make it further apart. So if I wanted that to be a little bit further apart, I could change that to 10. I can also use my little numbers, and you can see that the A is getting a little bit further apart. So it actually doesn't take too much to get it right. This one needs a little bit more. And remember, I'm only going to do this for the heading itself. I'm not going to do it for the body of the text. So the kerning is only on the heading or maybe on the subheading. Now let's say that the education of the architect, I wanted this font to be a little bit different. So here I might come up and say, OK, well, let me pick a different font. Right? That was an ugly font. That's awful. I was looking for a scripted font. There we go. So this obviously is not readable. It's not legible because I'm having a hard time. This said the education of the architect. Let me change the case. Right? It said the education of the architect, right? And so I've changed that font. Maybe that font actually needs to be a little bit bigger. And that's my subheading. And then I get into the actual body text. So let me look at this body text. I'd really like this, and I'm going to work with this first paragraph here to begin with. The first paragraph, I think the text is too large at 16 point. I want to drop it to like 10. That feels a little bit better in the context of what I'm trying to do. Not sure what happened with that last little bit of space. We're going to have to correct that as we go forward. So I've got the size correct. That feels pretty good. Now I can do a few other things. I could take this first number here, and I can do what's called a drop cap to it. And so that's available. Let me see where it is. It's not listed here, so I'm going to have to go into my actual paragraph settings. So here's my paragraph settings. Oh, sorry, I forgot one major thing. So you guys aren't seeing this right now because you're not in the typography workspace. You're probably in the essentials workspace. So up here, near where you would close the document, is something called essentials. It's a little drop-down menu. It's probably, yeah, it's right in the black part of the projector, so you can't even see it. So go up here. There's a big button for Publish Online. Next to that would be the Essentials. Click on Essentials and switch down to Typography. I apologize for not telling you that earlier. This will then give you the typography options. And so from here, we could go into Paragraph. And under Paragraph, we should have the ability to do, right here is drop caps. So I could say, you know what? I want that first number to be 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, etc. So you've seen this in like books where the first line of the paragraph is big. We can do that. So in this case, it was 4 lines. I can also choose how many characters are included. So I could say, oh, I want the period to be included. I want the space. You get the idea. So let's say it's like that. I've done that. And I have my font already chosen, so we're good. Now, I did this for one of the paragraphs. It would be really annoying to go through my whole document and have to repeat this for every paragraph, right? So we can use something called a paragraph style. We'll get back to character styles in just a second. We can use something called a paragraph style that will allow us to repeat a specific look. You can set up the style ahead of time, or you can set up the style after you've created a paragraph that looks the way you want it to. So in this case, let's say that I like this paragraph. This is the way I want it to look. As long as my cursor is in this paragraph, I can come to the paragraph styles. It's this window option here. And I can click the Add New Style, Create New Style. When I do that, it's called Paragraph Style 1. I could call this Drop Cap 4 Line, for lack of something better. You want it to be descriptive. And then all I have to do is click into one of these other paragraphs and choose Drop Cap 4 Line, and it's going to copy the same style to that paragraph. Same thing here, Drop Cap 4 Line. Pretty easy. And so that allows us to change it. The other advantage here is now that I've assigned that particular paragraph style to all of these, you can go back and you can say, you know what, I really didn't like it with the drop cap, or I didn't want it to be 4 lines. We can double click on the drop cap 4 line paragraph style. And it will bring up the paragraph style options. And we can come down here to drop caps. And we can say, you know what, I really wanted it to be 3. We can also check the box for preview so we can see how that changes. 3. All right, that looks pretty good. We can have a nested character style. We'll get to character styles in a second. I'm just pointing that out there. We can also set up other rules for our particular paragraph. So I could say, you know what, I would like there to be, let me see here, justification. I could change spacing here, indents and spacing. Let's do that one. Alignment, I could say, you know what, I wanted all of them to be centered. Not that you would. I wanted all of them to be right justified. I want all of them to be left. OK, that feels a little bit better. I can also choose to indent the first line. Or all, in this case, it's the left indent. It's the whole paragraph. We've got first line indent. Let's say I want that first line to go over a little bit. The other thing that I could do is I could indent the whole paragraph. And I could reverse indent the first line. Oops. If I wanted to. Just something to be aware of. Like that, if you wanted to. Okay, good stretch. So you've got a lot of options in here, and part of today's purpose in this first part of the exercise when you're playing with the Vitruvius text is getting yourself familiar with what these options are and how they work. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of that because I don't necessarily like it. Sorry, wrong. I have to go positive here. And negative. And say OK. But that change applies to all the paragraphs with that paragraph style. So once you've set it up, it's really easy to go back through and say, you know what, I want it a certain way. So now let's think about it in a different way. We've got this word here, knowledge, that's bold. It's a key important piece of this. Let's say that I wanted to emphasize that by changing the color of it. So right now it's black. I could change the color. And I could say, you know what, I'm going to make that a red word because it's really important. I'd like to be able to repeat this same strategy here on the other bold words. So what I can do is I can select the word, and I can go into my character styles, which is essentially the font styles, and I could say create a character style. And we'll call this one red. Oops, sorry. Now that I have that set, I can go through and on any of these bold words, I can apply the character style to those bold words. And there's another one. And there's another one. Oh. And now all of those bold words have that character style applied to them, the red. Now, if I decided that I didn't like the red anymore and I wanted them to be a different color or a different style, I can go back into the red character style, and I can look at the character itself. So I could change the font, for example. Right now it has no font assigned, so it would apply to any font. The font style is bold. The size has nothing applied, so the only thing it has on it is bold. I do have, under character colors, I have it set as red. I could change it and say I want all of them to be green. And when I do that, all of the bold text will now be green. So you guys see how that works, where the style allows it to apply to multiple things. So I could go back and say, you know what, I did like it in red. We'll make it back in red. I could say that, you know what, I'd like to underline all of those. I could turn an underline style on. And then we'd have each of those underlined. So I've got a lot of flexibility here. I could control the weight of the underline. If I wanted to be a little bit more specific, I could say, you know what, I want it to be a thinner underline. I want it to be a thicker underline. You can play around with what that would be. You could choose to strike through. That essentially means cross it off if you wanted to. I'm not going to do that, but I'm showing you that as well. So when I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK. So now maybe I wanted to make these letters stand out a little bit more, or these numbers, sorry. Maybe I wanted a different font to be applied. This is rapidly getting really ugly. Right? Let's say that I liked that font for some reason, and I wanted to use that font. I can do the same thing. I can come over here and create a character style for it. And we'll call this drop cap style. And say OK. So now I have a drop cap style. I could go through and apply that to every one of the drop caps. Or I could go back to my paragraph styles, open up my drop cap 4-line, go into my drop caps, and I could say I want on this drop cap the drop cap style to apply to it. In which case all the drop caps would now have the drop cap style. So it's a nested style within. So it's just another option. For this heading, I could create a style for this heading if I wanted to. And again, the advantage to all of this is that it is repeatable. You can have the same thing applying, and you can go back in and change. So I have this paragraph that was my drop cap 4-line. If I wanted the font size to change, I could say, you know what, let me override the font size. I want all of it to be 11 now. Or better yet, I need this to be a little bit longer. Let's keep it at 10 point, but let's come over to the tracking and let's space it out a little bit. You guys get the idea. Maybe that was a little too far, too obvious for my English teacher. That's a little bit better. I'll go ahead and say OK. I'm picking on English teachers today. Sorry if any of you end up becoming an English teacher. So there it is in terms of how you set this stuff up and how you work through it. And that's really the purpose today, is to get comfortable with it. So the first half of our exercise is to play around with this Vitruvius text. See if I can get it up here. And experiment with it. The next thing that I want to show you is that you can choose to load in your own fonts into the system. And I use a program that runs off your flash drive that I think works particularly well to load it up. And it's available online. You can do a Google search for it if you want. I also have a link to it. It's right here. We can go to the AMP font viewer. You know what? I'm not logged in, so it's not going to let me see any of this. Let me log in real quick. Sorry. There we go. It's 0.15, the AMP font viewer. And the advantage of this AMP font viewer is it allows us to temporarily install a font on a system that's not ours. If you were working on your home computer or on your laptop, it's really easy. You download a font, you double-click it, and you can install it. It's not a problem. On the school computers, it can be a little bit iffy as to whether they'll let you do it because of the restrictions. Sometimes it'll let you, sometimes it won't. It depends. Question? It did allow you to. So I don't plan on the fact that it'll allow you to, because they change security restrictions all the time as to whether we're allowed to or not allowed to. This will always let you do it. I'm going to go ahead and open up the link for it. There's also a there's a link to the website itself. Here it is. These things are always a little bit challenging because you have to figure out which pieces of this page are ads and which pieces are not. So if you wait a little bit, you'll get the secure download or the external mirror. Either one will get you there. And it should download. We hope. There it is. So be patient. Don't click all these download links because they're not the stuff that you are trying to get. It should be fontviewer.zip is what we're looking for. It'll come down as a zip file. You need to extract it. So there, I choose on my flash drive, I have a folder for resources, portable applications, and that's where I keep it, just in case I need it down the road. So I already have it, so I'm not going to actually do that. Let me go to my flash drive, and there it is. And I can open it. It opens this page here. We can then load any font that we want. So we have installed fonts and we have not installed fonts. We click on not installed fonts, and then we have to go find the font wherever it's saved. I have some already saved on my flash drive that I tend to keep in my resources folder called fonts. And this is where a bunch of the fonts, like the architect font that I use, are stored. So I can load those in temporarily. If you want to find a free font, they're everywhere online, easy to find. Font Squirrel is a website that has them, for example. And so they have all kinds of different fonts that you can download. It's a great way of changing what your paper looks like or your work looks like because you're using a slightly different font than what is the standard available on the computer. So any one of those are fine. You can download those and install them. When you find a font that you want, so let's see. I'll use this one because it stands out a little bit. I'll go ahead and install font temporarily. Yes, I want to install it temporarily, and it will then put it into my system. I have to leave all of this open behind what I'm working on because it'll keep it open, and then I can go find that. It was Argon, if I remember correctly. There it is, and now it's loaded in. So it's just a way of temporarily loading the fonts. Obviously, the next time the computer restarts, you have to make sure you load that font again so that you could use it if you wanted to use it again. It's something I like to point out as a strategy in case you want to load different fonts. For me personally, I have some fonts on my Mac that I use all the time that aren't available on Windows. So if I wanted to open a document where I was using one of those fonts, I'd have to load the font ahead of time. If you want to take a stab at just having the operating system install it, you can double click and see if it'll let you do it. It seemed to let you do it. That's great. I have no problem with you doing it that way, but I can never promise that the lab computers will let you do it, which is why I tell you the other strategy. OK. So the second part, or excuse me, the third part of today is part 3, which is word art. This is going to take you the rest of the time, and it's going to increase your familiarity with fonts, typefaces, etc. If you do a Google search for word art, you'll get a bunch of examples of what I mean. It does not have to be one where they're, like we don't have to do the Steph Curry example. Okay, you can very easily just pick a basic shape or even not a shape at all. If you just work through your text, it could be something like this one, right, where it doesn't make any particular shape. The idea here is that you're working with multiple fonts, multiple sizes, multiple styles, getting familiar with what all of those look like, how you access all of those options. This should be about you It's a personal, self-reflective word art, so it should be describing you. Therefore, you should be familiar with yourself, so you should be able to do this. And so if you're really struggling, go through and look at some of the examples of word art online that can help you get there. And so you're going to spend the rest of the time today working on some kind of a word art collage. That'll be what you post at the end of class today. So do always make sure that you save your InDesign files. So we'll go to File and then Save. This saves the InDesign file. In addition, for your export, for when you go to post, you're going to go to File and then Export. And for our purposes today, instead of doing a PDF, we are going to do JPEGs or PNGs. Either one is fine. And that will save a JPEG or a PNG. Remember, when you actually do save this, it's going to present you with options. The quality should always be maximum, and the resolution should be at least 300. For our purposes, a resolution of 300 is just fine. This is tied typically to the printer that you're going to print on. So in our case, we're going to be printing at 300 because it would go to the laser printer, not that you're printing today. That 300 is then set by the printer. So we want it to match that resolution. If we had a higher resolution printer, we'd up the resolution here on our export. Make sense? All right, so I'll turn you guys loose and let you work on that. I have to spend a little bit of time and get your grade sheets printed, and then I'll come around and distribute the grade sheets so that you guys have that. And if there's no other questions, I'll let you work.